Welcome to Groton Matters, where we look at important issues in a thorough, fair, and balanced manner, all in the interest of making informed decisions. My name is Jack Petropoulos. I'm your host. And the question of the day is, should we turn the responsibility for appointing or selecting our town clerk over to the select board? Today, well, the voters do that. But the question is that you'll see on May 24th during our town election is, shall we make that the responsibility of the select board? Here to help us understand that, or the issues behind that and make a better decision are a couple of people. We'll start with Mike Bouchard. Mike is our current town clerk. And then we'll move on to Josh Deegan and Bruce Esom, who will argue the various perspectives here. Bruce will argue for keeping it the responsibility of the electorate. And Josh will argue for moving this responsibility to the select board. But to start us off, let's welcome Mike Bouchard. Mike?
Hi, Jack. Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for taking the time to be here. It's important that people understand what you do if they're going to make a decision about who should choose the next town clerk.
Yeah.
So, Mike, the town clerk's position is really a mix of technical, administrative, and management responsibility. Can you give us a high-level description of that role? And we'll go into some of the specifics in a little bit, but just high level, what does the town clerk do?
Well, I can try to summarize that pretty shortly. The clerk's role is really a varied role. And it's technical in the sense that there are a lot of state laws, procedures, regulations that the clerk's office needs to follow. It's administrative in that we keep a lot of records about a lot of things. And it's management because, we have people, we have budgets, and we have an office to run. So we just try to keep it running smoothly. Got it.
Well, so what does it take for a guy to do this role, or for anybody to do this role? Sorry, I don't mean to imply it's just a guy. What do you bring personally to this that has helped you to execute this role?
Well, it's a great question. I've thought about that over time. And, my background is, I was middle management in corporate America. I had my own business for a little bit. I have skills in project management, product management. I have communication skills where we dealt with customers and the press in these previous jobs. And I find that all of these skills really come into play here because we're trying to communicate to the public. We're trying to, identify programs and ways that the public can interact with town government and execute things like elections.
Got it. So I think the best way that I've heard you describe this role is that you manage the state laws which relate to the public's access to government. And when I thought about that summary, it just really struck me as amazingly comprehensive and amazingly important. It involves so many things, and let's talk about a few of those. Let's start off with your role as an official records access officer. What does that mean?
So, the public, the basic premise of the law in operations is that the public has a right to government information, unless there's specific reasons like security information or privacy information. So the public, many of the public know I should go to the building department and get a copy of the building file. Many of the public don't know how to access these records, don't know who keeps these records. So there is designated, and the clerk is the default in the law to be what's called the official records access officer. So remember, the public is looking for public documents. If they don't know where to turn, they can turn to the records access officer, whose job it is to find the document and offer the response.
Yeah, that's amazing. And over time, I've watched you administer public information requests. And sometimes that means, I don't want to say prying loose, but getting information that government sometimes isn't just dying to give away, but that they have a right to. And you're put in the position of sort of being the middle person saying, you know what, we do, or you know what, we don't have the right to withhold that information from the public. That's a sensitive role.
Well, it's in Groton, I would say, though, by far, we're very open with our records.
Yep.
And it's really a matter of sometimes the records request is a very complex record, so it involves coordinating amongst various departments, people who hold the records, and it works pretty well. We've been okay.
I don't think you can understate the value of that freedom that we have, access information, and of the role of making sure that information is available. So hats off to you. You also do a lot with regard to public meetings. Public meetings are, again, something we take for granted as a public, but the public meetings are very important. Tell us a little bit about your role with regard to public meetings.
So, the business of government is really run in public meetings, select board meetings, assessors meetings, all kinds of meetings that are open to the public. And the public has a right to know when the meeting is going to be, what's being discussed. And if they didn't see the meeting, what was discussed, so the minutes of the meeting. So the clerk's role is to post public meetings with an agenda, within this, outside, with a 48-hour weekday notice of every public meeting, and to keep the records. So once a meeting has occurred, minutes are produced, the clerk records these records and keeps them on a permanent basis.
Something that I think we also take for granted, but there's also a lot of suspicion around sometimes, is this issue of conflict of interest. And I think you play an important role in making sure that there is no, or that conflicts of interest are made clear. Tell us a little bit about that.
The conflict of interest law in the state of Massachusetts is actually a very complex law, and I am really not qualified to interpret the law. However, I do feel I'm qualified to advise somebody when they should seek, professional advice from the attorney of the day or from town council, or in some cases, it's a matter of filing a disclosure form, which again is a public record stored at the town clerk's office. So my role there, the town clerk's role there, is to is really to help. We're familiar enough with conflict of interest law that we can guide people as to what their appropriate good steps would be.
Great. And I don't think there's a more important role for the town clerk. You may, others might, but I don't think there's a more important role than the administration of elections. And that can't be a small thing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, elections can be complex. And this is where I mentioned, project management as being a good skill for this job. An election, I look at it as a series of projects. There are distinct phases in conducting an election. Town elections run differently than a state election. Whereas in the town environment, we're responsible soup to nuts. In the state elections, we partner with the state to do their local implementation. The regulations, the rules are essentially the same, but it really is a series of different projects, and it's our job to execute.
Okay. There's so much more to what you do that I've learned about as we've talked more about this. You manage a lot with regard to town meeting, maintenance of records, the things that people really associate with the clerk a lot, the dog tags and marriage certificates, birth certificates, oaths of office. And as you mentioned before, you're a department head with a couple of employees and a budget and many public transactions to manage. So there is a lot that you do. And I think sometimes that's invisible to people. So how long have you been town clerk?
I've been fortunate enough to be here for 14 and a half years, Jack. It's been great.
That's a long time. What feedback have you gotten on your office and the management of the office? And I know you are an incredibly humble guy, but don't hesitate to toot the office's horn, if not your own.
Thank you, Jack, for the comments. I would say that the general feedback I've gotten over the years is that this is a competent and professionally run office. And I'm very proud of that. Our job is, we're not a business, but if you go into a business environment, you expect service for what you're asking for. And our job, while the service delivery is a little bit different, I think we do a good job of responding to citizen requests and giving them access to government and providing the services that we can provide.
I tell you, I've never heard otherwise, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about it as having a lot that's similar to running a business. What qualities would you look for if you were selecting the next clerk?
It's a job that a lot of people can do this job, but it's not for everyone. And I mentioned, skills that have helped me, project management, communications. I think those are really important skills. Anybody coming into this job will have unique strengths and unique opportunities to learn things. And there's plenty of opportunity to learn in this position. But I think we need to be looking for, or somebody considering this position ought to try to evaluate themselves in terms of, are they organized? Can they run in a interrupt-driven environment, as we are often? Can you manage multiple activities or projects simultaneously? And are you focused on getting the job done?
Well, thank you. And actually, that brings us to thank you, Mike. First of all, thank you for your 14 years of service. Those 14 years have seemed to me, as a member of the public who pays attention, to have gone without a hitch. And I just appreciate your work so much, and I'm sure so many other people do. And thank you for taking the time to be here. I think this is a really important segment of this show, because how can people really know how to choose their next clerk if they don't know what that clerk does? So Mike B., thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care.
Thanks.
All right, so the question before voters here today, or actually on the 24th of May, is shall we change our charter to allow the select board to appoint the town clerk rather than having the voters elect a town clerk, which is the case today? You've heard a little bit about the responsibilities for what the town clerk does from Mike Bouchard. And here to help us to look at the arguments on both sides of that decision that the town's going to have to make are Bruce Esom and Josh Deegan. Bruce is a gentleman who's spent a lot of time in town on lots of boards and committees, and whose opinion is very well respected. Josh is a select board member and has been for many years. Josh will help us to argue the position of in favor of making this change, and Bruce the position of keeping things as they are. Josh, why don't you start us off and give us a sense at a very high level of what the pro argument is, why we would want to make this change?
Sure, thanks, Jack.
Sure.
So bottom line with the town clerk is that the job has evolved in a significant way over the past 15 or 20 years, where federal and state reporting requirements for both elections, for census data, and things like marriages, death certificates, dog licenses, you name it. There's a tremendous responsibility that the town clerk has to have. And that we have been blessed with our current town clerk, Mike Bouchard, who is going to be retiring in the very near future, to have an individual who will operate at a very high level, putting in the requisite amount of hours and being fair and impartial.
Okay.
So therefore, I would say that the reason that the town should be concerned about electing as opposed to appointing, or appointing as opposed to electing, is it changes the dynamic. Right now, we are electing the clerk, and anybody can choose to run and turn it into a popularity contest. In the past, we've had town clerk many years ago, at least 20 plus years ago, that didn't work 40 hours plus per week, had malfeasance occur within the office where cases of fraud occurred, and that elected boards are policy setting boards. Whereas, if you look at the select board, we set policy, planning board, it sets policy, school committee, it sets policy. The town clerk is not a policy decider. The town clerk has to be fair and independent. And with all these technical challenges that are involved with the position, just like town manager, just like our town accountant, just like any of the senior level positions, they are all appointed by the select board to do the management and have a job description that stipulates how long, how many hours, and what they're going to do, and will be subject to a performance review. That does not occur with an elected position for town clerk. So at this point, we unanimously, as a board of selectmen, select board, are fully in favor of changing from an elected position to an appointed position.
Okay. Bruce, I'll get to you in just a second. Is there no performance review for the town clerk today? I thought the town manager does a performance review.
Not to my knowledge. I've never seen one.
Okay. I think there is, but I could very well be wrong. Bruce, the argument for keeping things as they are.
So I think Josh makes an excellent argument, what I would call a utilitarian argument. But what I'd like to do is make an argument about the theory of government. So it's important to sort of look back in history about how governments evolved, including our own. Before the Enlightenment, basically governments were run by kings. And if you were born into one of those particular city-states, your job was to be loyal to the king and keep your head down. But in the 1700s, we had this thing called the Enlightenment. And men like Adams, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, came up with this idea of turning the whole idea of government on its head. And what they did is they said government legitimacy actually comes from the population that's being governed. It doesn't come from heredity, and it doesn't come from God. And that is a radical concept. But it does require, in order to work, that the public be involved in the process of oversight of the government. The government works for the people needs to keep its eye on the government. As part of this bargain, the public has been given perhaps the most precious and useful gift it will ever receive, and that is the right to cast a vote and have it counted. Right now, the public is being given an opportunity to actually give away that gift. And they're being asked to give it to the executive branch, who seems willing to accept it. But the question is, what are we getting for that? And what's the big deal anyway? Well, one way to look at this is to look what happens when too much power gets transferred to the executive branch in government. And fortunately, there are many cases where you can look around and see what's happened. And I would point you to the federal government. Some would say that we started out with 3 co-equal branches of government, but today there's really only 2 functioning branches. There is the executive and there is the judicial. And why is that? I would argue that part of the reason is the legislative branch has essentially given to the executive branch its roles and responsibilities. We don't have any EPA regulations coming from legislation. They're all executive orders. And what happens when somebody has a problem with the executive order? They don't go to the legislature, they go to the courts. So the bottom line here is it's very important that the legislative body, in this case, voters, hold on to this most important gift rather than transferring it for short-term gain for the possibility of increased efficiency to the executive board. Because if history tells us anything, the executive board, unrestrained, will take for itself as much power and responsibility as it can get away with.
Okay. So I've sort of noted here a real pragmatic approach and a real philosophical approach. Josh's approach seems very pragmatic, based on making stuff work right here, right now. Yours seems very philosophical, based on experience in how government works and how government can fail to work.
I'm looking long-term and
Yeah.
projecting forward from sort of a historical perspective.
Jack,
You see that, Josh? See it the same way?
absolutely not.
I mean, sorry, I mean, in those 2 different ways of looking at things.
Yes, I see the approach that Bruce has and the approach I have. And to a certain degree, while fundamentally and philosophically, I understand where Bruce is coming from, I know that the town and the way it's been run through its select board is that we've given away a lot of the power. Back in 2008, when the town of Groton adopted a charter for the first time and wanted to go to a town manager form of government, the select board at the time was running the day-to-day operations through a town administrator with full oversight of the town. That was a tremendous amount of power. We gave that power to the town manager so the town would be more professionally run. And I see this situation analogous to that situation, where if we were to elect somebody who was a nobody, who just decided that, yeah, I like the $90,000 a year plus benefits position, and I'm going to run a popularity contest, and I might not do the job to the level that the current town clerk does. So with that said, we have accountability by appointing with oversight through the town manager.
So would you guys agree that there's not one right answer here, that both of these positions are viable positions? Or do you think that really there is one right way to do this? Josh?
Town meeting voted on this in fall of last year to move to this. The current town clerk supported that vote at the time. I guess with that said, it's worked well for most part, as long as Groton has been a town. And the naysayer would say, well, something could go wrong, and I'm playing devil's advocate in the position that we would be better served by going there. But could both work well? Yes.
You think there's one right answer here, Bruce?
For me, the number of right answers is exactly 1. Others may say 0. Some may say 2. Others may say more. But for me, it's 1. And it's not clear what it is right now, but history will tell us.
Okay, great. So, we've talked a lot, and we've even mentioned it here. We talk a lot about personalities and people when we look at this. I hear lots of reference to our current police and fire chiefs as appointed officials, and they do a great job, and therefore the appointment process is the right process. Do you think it's a good idea to be talking about a single personality as an example? I mean, typically as an example of doing well, but maybe even as an example of doing badly, but a personality as an example when you're writing public policy? Or can it be dangerous to point to someone and say, look at this case, and therefore this is what we should always do? Bruce?
Well, I look more at human nature than I look at individuals. And that's why a historic perspective is very helpful in trying to understand what are the consequences and unintended consequences of these kinds of decisions. And although you never know who's going to come down the pipe, you can be pretty sure it's a human, and they have all the built-in foibles that humans have had for generations, if not centuries. And therefore, you need to construct a system that can deal with, let's say, the incongruities of human thinking and actions.
Yeah, okay. Josh, the idea of looking at a personal example and saying this worked this way, and therefore we should do it this way or should not do it this way because of that. What do you think about that?
Well, I like Bruce's answer a lot. And overall, I agree with it, with one fundamental difference, is that when someone is elected, they are elected, and specifically to town clerk, it would be for a 3-year term, and that's what it has been. If you elect someone and they are inept and they cannot do the job, there is only one way to remove an elected official. It's through recall. Well, actually 2 ways. They could die. But with that saying, assuming that it is the former rather than the latter, recall has not occurred to my knowledge in the 30+ years that I've lived in this town. And I think that a lot of the voters are very unfamiliar with the process. Therefore, by moving to an appointed position, if someone is found to be inept or inadequate in that position, they can be terminated and replaced by somebody who can do the job. But human nature, as Bruce says, shows the frailties and mistakes that people will make. And I am concerned that the wrong position or the wrong person could get into the position at some point in the future, just like select board, just like school committee or any other board. So the difference is we have the power to remove that individual should that occur.
But the question is it a good idea to point to our current police chief, for instance, and say, we appointed this police chief, he is great, and therefore we should appoint all officials? Is that a useful way of making public policy? That was my question.
No, it's too vanilla.
Okay. I mean, that's a simple answer, and I happen to agree. Qualifications, can we get as good a candidate if we restrict eligible candidates to being residents of our town? Can we get as good a candidate in the elective system rather than the appointment system where we advertise and they don't have to be a resident? Josh?
To elected or appointed, Jack?
Well, either way, argue either case, but the question is our ability to get a candidate different in the elected versus appointed model.
Yes, absolutely. We have a very closed market of about 11,000 people in Groton. Those that are of age that could be appointed with the qualifications, even less so. And by broadening our horizons, you can't run for an elected position unless you are a Groton resident and of legal age. Whereas for an appointed position, the world is your oyster. We could get anybody from Timbuktu to Milwaukee, to Holyoke, to Natick, to Grafton, to anywhere. So,
okay. Bruce, what do you think in terms of qualifications? Do we limit ourselves if we limit ourselves to a resident?
Well, it seems to me if the problem is the size of the pool, the solution is not to transfer the responsibility to the select board. The solution to that problem is change the charter so that you can have a elected clerk from outside the town of Groton. That seems the solution to the problem that was just described.
And you know, we heard Mike talk a little bit about what it takes to do this job. How well can an electorate assess those qualifications versus a select board assess the qualifications of a candidate? Bruce?
Each method has its own pitfalls. But for me, who's an advocate of the idea of the wisdom of crowds, which says that given a group of individuals to make a decision, they will come up with a better decision than a single individual chosen to make it because of the breadth of understanding. And by that, you may get some people in the pool that don't know anything, your basic uninformed voters, and people that know a lot. But I think the process, when it plays out, has the chance of producing somebody who is objectively good for the job or good enough for the job.
Okay. Josh, it seems like core to your argument is that the select board is in a better position to assess qualifications. What do you think?
I think that the 5 individuals that serve on the select board at any given time have been vetted out by the public. And to Bruce's point, there's a tremendous amount of knowledgeable individuals, and then there's many unknowledgeable individuals about candidates and where they stand on things. And I am concerned about the dilution rate in terms of how it would work out, because sometimes it becomes more of a popularity contest. And you know, just because somebody's popular and says, vote for me because I'll do this for you if you vote for me. Mm-hmm. We've seen this occur here in town, in the state, and most recently in national elections. Okay. I don't want to see that occur. I think we need this town run with a high level of professionalism.
Yeah, but the question is about assessing.
The select board is uniquely qualified with individuals that are able, through the application process, working with our HR director and town manager, to narrow it down, interview, and then hire a successful candidate.
Okay. And as much as I talked earlier about, I asked you if you thought it was a bad idea to look at a particular individual and say, this is how that person performed and they were appointed or elected, and therefore we should appoint or elect. As much as that is, it's probably not great to look at a single individual. Over time, we have made decisions about, with regard to appointing people, and we have elected people. And is it fair to say that we can point to bad appointments and bad elections, and that neither the appointment method nor the election method has a monopoly on being good or bad? Josh?
They both have their pluses and minuses. And needless to say, there have been bad appointments that have occurred that have been made under my tenure as a select board member. Not a lot, but there certainly have been bad ones. The good ones far outweigh 10 times, 20 times the bad ones. But when a bad appointment occurs, there is a solution in terms of all hires are 6-month probationary out of the gate. And if you can't assess the performance of somebody within 6 months, if they're not doing the job, you can let them go. In an elected situation, it's not that simple to get rid of someone we put in that position.
Okay. Bruce, what do you think about the history of appointments versus the history of electeds, in terms of the track record of people performing under each of those scenarios? Can we point to good and bad in each, or has one tended to be more effective than the other?
Well, I can point to one good appointment, and that would be me. Thank you, Board of Selectmen, for appointing me and reappointing me and reappointing me.
Okay.
I can also give you and I can also give you a bad example of a appointee, and that would also be me. Because as you know, in certain situations, I have voted against the best interest of this town as a member of a board in this town, because I believe that my position is to represent the best interest of the public. I am a public servant. And sometimes the interest of the town is aligned with the public, and sometimes it is not. And I will vote for the public. That puts me in bad stead in some situations as an appointee of the town of Groton.
Okay, so, but you could easily have taken those same positions as an elected official. The fact that you were appointed didn't cause you to take those positions, correct? That those positions were based on your philosophy and the issue at hand, correct?
Well, one of them began a process of trying to get me thrown off the Conservation Commission.
Okay, well, evidently that didn't work.
No, I survived by just one vote. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Board of Selectmen.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, this was a really important question, because I know that I could point to quite a number of appointees that didn't work out very well, and had to be removed. I can't point to a lot of elected officials that haven't worked out all that well. At the same time, I know I can point to a lot of appointees that worked out tremendously well. And we could go down that road of saying names of people, and I think that's useless. But I guess the question was, is one of these uniquely prone to failure? And I'm not hearing you guys, either of you, say that that's the case. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say they're uniquely prone to different failures.
Okay, Josh, can you top that?
No.
Okay. Well, I did want to talk about the difficulty of removal. And Josh, you've spoken to this a little bit. So Bruce, what do you think about the challenge of removing someone who's appointed or elected if they turn out to be operating not in the best interest of the town?
Yeah, so my understanding.
Is one method harder, and therefore should one method perhaps be just avoided?
Well, let's have a comparison scenario I'll put on the table for your consideration. Imagine a elected town clerk who is a screw up. The prescribed method for getting rid of that person is to run a recall election on them. Now look at a situation where we have a town clerk who's a screw up that a select board is in love with. Now what is the public to do? The public has to now recall the members of the select board in order to change the member of the select board and then change the clerk. So it becomes a barrier to change instituted by the voting public.
Well, so Josh, just in the interest of time, briefly, if you had something else to add here, I know you did cover this removal scenario pretty thoroughly.
I think that the scenario that Bruce just played out is highly unlikely. I think that you have 5 individuals that can recognize a screw up. And I've been on one side of a situation where I've thought in the past somebody was a screw up, but 4 other board members found that they weren't. And they were enamored. And you need to fight your convictions in terms of your position. And Jack, you served on the board, you understand what that's like. But I think that, you know, you have the doomsday scenario, Bruce, that you've played out. And I understand why you've played it out, but it's a lot easier to remove an individual that is appointed than to remove an individual that is elected.
Let's move on to political influence. You know, would an elected or an appointed clerk be more or less likely to be impacted by political or other forms of influence? Bruce?
They're influenced by different forms of political influence based upon the method by which they were appointed. You make it sound like being affected by political influence is a bad thing, but a responsive public elected official ought to be, to some extent, responsive to the needs and wants of the public as expressed to him through voting and other methods.
Okay.
For the appointed official, their obligation is primarily to satisfy the needs and wants of the town manager and, by association, the select board, and that has its own set of complications.
Josh, what do you think about the impact of political influence on the town clerk, especially the breadth that Bruce is talking about here?
Bruce makes a valid argument. I can't disagree with his argument, but I also think that, you know, you can have political influence on anybody. And the most important position in town that I could think of that should not be impacted by political influence is the town clerk. And when you elect somebody to clerk in the current format, it depends who shows up and what political influences they have when they vote. Not so much on the clerk directly, but in terms of their personal influences and how they feel the clerk is. Now, the select board in its current makeup, I do not see political influences in any way, shape, or fashion influencing who would be appointed to clerk.
I think one of the things we talked about, though, was we don't point to a current person or a current board because, yeah, a current board could be great, but we're setting policy for the long term. I wanted to ask about, you know, the clerk is responsible for enforcement of ethics, conflict of interest, open meeting laws, public information requests, et cetera. And oftentimes that enforcement falls on enforcing these things on members of the appointing body, the select board. Do you think that is a challenge for the clerk, Josh?
No, I think that the town clerk, whomever serves that role, is going to work in concert with the State Ethics Commission, as they are the ultimate decision on whether something is a conflict of interest. Certainly, town council weighs in on things when conflicts come up, and I do not see that as being an issue.
How about it, Bruce? Somebody files an ethics complaint against a select board member, and the town clerk has to mitigate that. Think that's a challenge for an appointed clerk?
This is exactly the case where you want an elected official to run elections and handle the ethics issues. The person who's elected, it will never be put in a position to have an ethics complaint against the public at large who appointed them. Their obligation is for people who have sworn to uphold the duties of whatever office that they're holding. So there is no conflict in that case. And it seems unfortunate to have to put a clerk in a position to have to bring the hammer down on one of their co-workers and somebody who actually may have hired them.
Okay. And the clerk, one of the primary jobs of the clerk is to run elections. Do you see a conflict of interest in running an election for the people that appointed you? And it's worth noting that when you run an election, if you're an elected clerk, you're running an election for yourself.
Correct.
Yeah. Josh, what do you think about that? I mean, is that just a mixed bag there?
Look, you hit the nail on the head on that one. In terms of the elected position when the clerk is running and how they have to oversee the elections to themselves. If they're appointed and you have somebody with a high level of integrity, And the individual, whomever would be hired in the appointed situation, would have a full police background check, a complete clean record in the past. Now, does that mean that any influence could occur to them to run a rigged election? Theoretically, sure it could. Depends if you're a believer in rigged elections or you're a believer in fair elections. I personally am a believer in fair elections and wouldn't consider anyone as a candidate that didn't answer a series and a battery of questions about the fairness of elections and election integrity.
Right. Bruce? Running elections for your boss, running elections for yourself. I'll note that the state has some exemptions for a clerk's ability, recognizes the challenge of a clerk running their own elections and has a lot of prescriptions around it. But it's still an issue. Bruce?
So it is an issue, and at least for me, it's a risk I'm willing to accept. If we look back over the history of elected town clerks, I think we have, at least in my memory, been able to avoid that situation. So it's not something that we need to be immediately concerned with. It seems to have been dealt with in the past. I would say dealt with well in the past. And the proof of that is the fact that we still have a working government and election process in the town of Groton 350 years on.
Okay. I'm going to give you sort of a worst case scenario. You know, we're hearing all about election boards and election bodies throughout the country starting to rejigger the way elections are run. And it seems like the rejiggering is with an intended outcome and is the antithesis of free and fair elections. And if we had an appointed clerk and we had a body of the select board that wanted things to come out a certain way, do you believe that that's something that we need to be afraid of here? Or are we just so immune from that that it's just fear mongering even to talk about it? Bruce, why don't we start with you?
Once you control somebody's financial future by having the ability to fire them at any time, the expectation that you would get honest, fair, let's say, performance is something that you should be aware of or caution about. So the advantage of the elected official is the standard for removal, that is the recall, is a fairly high standard, which in my mind at least has the opportunity for the people to do, for the person in that position to do the right thing, even though the consequences may be difficult. It provides a degree of insulation to make tough decisions.
Okay. Josh, what if select board members, a majority of the select board members wanted an outcome to be a certain way? Do you think that in our town, in the controls that we've got, that there's any kind of worry about that, and that worry is enhanced by having an appointed versus an elected clerk?
Well, all I can speak for is the history that I'm knowledgeable about in my capacity as a select board member. And while I've disagreed vehemently with fellow board members over many issues in the past, the one thing I must say is for 99% of the time, I have seen the highest level of integrity, even when individuals have disagreed with one another on our board, in terms of maintaining fairness, openness, and not breaking the law. So with that said, I would find it far-fetched that anybody could try and rig an election through a conspiracy from the inside, working in conjunction with the town clerk to create an outcome that meets the needs of an individual or a board.
Okay. Great. Well, I think for me, that wraps up a lot of the sort of hard pointed questions that I have, but I think I want to ask about this sort of, if we can agree on this, and that is that over time, whatever method we choose as a town, that we're going to end up with some good clerks and some not so great clerks. And I just wonder if there's an agreement on that, and if you think that you might end up with more if we go one way than the other. Bruce?
I agree. There will be good clerks and there will be bad clerks, but the mechanism to deal with that situation is actually built in. And if people will identify and use it, I think we'll be in good stead. The competence of the clerk is less an issue for me. It's the concentration of power in the executive in town and what that does to the legislative body over time.
Okay. Josh, over time, good, bad? You're gonna get them anyway?
It's kind of like making soup, Jack. Okay. If you have a good recipe and you use really good ingredients, and I'm not making a joke out of this, I'm making an analogy. That if you have a good recipe and you use good ingredients, whether it be soup or the process for hiring a town clerk, in terms of doing the interviews, just like shopping for your groceries and your ingredients, you can create a excellent recipe for success and then implement that so everything tastes good to both the public and the soup eater.
Well, that wraps it up. And Josh, leave it to you. So I want to thank the both of you for taking the time to do this. This was short notice. And, you know, I know there's a lot to think about when you decide to get up and stand up and talk about this stuff. So really, thanks, Bruce, and Josh, to you too, both for the service that you both provide to the town and also for helping with this particular issue. I think that you gave two really good perspectives on this thing. And I think that's all that people can ask for as they think more about what decision they want to make on May 24th. I want to thank the Groton channel and particularly Noah for all the help that they give us in getting this thing produced and put out there. And also the viewers for taking the time to watch, to listen, and to send questions so that we can make it a little bit more valuable. If you have any questions about what we did here or comments about it, please don't hesitate to put your comments in the comments section below this video or to send comments to Groton Matters. You can send that to grotonmatters@gmail.com. Or you can, there's a way to contact us and have selection or suggestions on the website, which is grotonmatters.com. So again, thank you very much for taking the time. Please be sure to vote on May 24th. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yep, take care. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.